most of cancer research today, in contrast to what we've defined, is focused on the gene mutations associated with the disease. So the concept of personalized medicine in cancer involves the development of drugs that will target specific mutations that are found in various tumors with the hope of correcting the disease. The problem with that strategy is that there are literally thousands, and some people have even estimated millions of mutations in tumor cells, which makes the targeting of any one or a group of mutations a pretty daunting task. And most of these so-called targeted therapies come with a significant amount of adverse toxic effects, which I've always found strange, that if a personalized medicine is supposed to target and kill cancer cells specifically, why do the patients become so violently ill as the result of this so-called personalized medicine? It appears to me that many of these drugs have a very significant off-target effect on the body as well. Our approach to this disease is basically a non-toxic metabolic approach that targets the metabolic deficiency of the tumor while enhancing the health and vitality of normal cells, a very striking contrast. It's a disease of mitochondrial function, which is the key metabolic component within the cell. And when mitochondria become dysfunctional, one of the possible consequences is the origin of cancer. Otto Warburg found many years ago that the cancer cells are primarily fermenters of glucose. They take glucose in, they metabolize it up to the point of a molecule called pyruvate, which is then fermented. And it seems as though almost all cancer cells will have this property. And the reason for this is because their mitochondria have suffered some sort of insufficiency or damage. And as the result, the tumor cells then must ferment, which is a very primitive form of energy, in order for them to survive. So most tumor cells will either ferment glucose or possibly amino acids like glutamine for their survival. So this then allows these cells to grow and persist. You can prevent cancer simply by keeping your mitochondria healthy. And what I mean by that is that with age, your mitochondria get inefficient. And this is a natural aging process. That's why cancer is more common in older people than younger people. Therapeutic fasting is a great way to enhance the functionality of the mitochondria to prevent cancer. You will not get cancer if mitochondria are healthy. It's just mitochondria are damaged by a variety of different things in the environment: chemicals, radiation, inflammation, viruses. Even inherited gene mutations that damage certain kinds of these mutations will damage the functionality of the mitochondria, thereby leading to inherited forms of cancer. But by and large, we can prevent cancer if we can keep the mitochondria healthy. We have a very active research program in epilepsy, and we have developed some of the best animal models for epileptic seizures that I did with collaborators in Japan. We highlighted this one particular model, which is a replica of a human form of seizure. And it's known for decades that the ketogenic diet is very effective against seizure disorders in children. And we tested this on our animal model of epilepsy, and we found it to also be very, very therapeutic and effective in blocking these seizures. The mechanism by which the diet works against epilepsy is far less clear than understanding the mechanism by which the diet works to target and kill tumor cells, interestingly enough. But we found that the way these diets work is through a calorie restriction. The diets do not work if individuals or mice eat large amounts of these high-fat diets. So it was clearly linked to a calorie restriction. So we found that if we calorie restricted by a little bit these ketogenic diets, the therapeutic benefits of low glucose and elevated ketones become much greater than if one were simply to voluntarily restrict calories from any kind of a diet. So our understanding of how the diet was implemented for epilepsy allowed us to fine-tune this and transition it for cancer. And as the result, we think that the diet and this metabolic approach, to be specific, the ketogenic diet matched with certain low-dose non-toxic drugs could potentially be far more therapeutic for the cancer population than it is for the patients with epilepsy. If we view cancer as a genetic disease, and as I've written in my book, it's not a genetic disease, basically. The gene mutations are downstream epiphenomena of damaged respiration. So the mutations are red herrings, basically. And the reason why we're not making any major progress is because we're focusing on something that's not the prime problem of the disease. And it's been very clear. And most of the, interestingly enough, those few drugs that have had rather good success in the clinic, such as Gleevec and Herceptin and these ones that people have used for various blood and breast cancers, actually target the same metabolic pathway that does the ketogenic diet. The difference is the ketogenic diet will target those pathways in all cancers, whereas the so-called personalized drugs target those pathways only in those very few individuals that might have that mutation. So why anyone would want to use those toxic drugs when there's another alternative to do the same thing without toxic problems is a very difficult thing to comprehend. The ketogenic diet, which was originally developed for treatment of epilepsy in children, is a zero carbohydrate or very, very low carbohydrate, high-fat diet. And what happens when people eat the ketogenic diet in relatively restricted amounts, blood glucose levels go down and ketones go up. And ketones are breakdown products of fats, and they've evolved to provide our brain with energy when glucose is no longer available, or when people don't have ready access to food. Our bodies can make energy from within. We mobilize fats. The fats are then metabolized to these ketones, which then the brain can use as an alternative to glucose. So for the tumors now, the tumors which are dependent on glucose also, primarily for their growth, will have difficulty in now trying to compete with normal cells for the availability of a restricted food source, which is glucose. On the other hand, the tumor cells can't utilize the ketones for energy as can the normal cells. So this diet, this metabolic therapy, pretty much restricts the primary fuels for the tumor, while the body can transition to the ketones and can actually get healthier with this. A very nice way to marginalize the tumor growth. The ketogenic diet is it's mostly certain parts. The way we define them is a 1-to-1, 2-to-1, or 3-to-1. This means 2 parts fat to 1 part protein plus carbohydrate. And the more ketogenic the diet is, the greater the amount of fat. So the most fat-laden diets would be a 4-to-1, 4 parts fat to 1 part protein plus carb. Now, what these diets will consist of is a variety of butters and creams and coconut oils and these kinds of things, which are metabolized to ketone bodies, while keeping the carbohydrate content of the diet very low. The proteins are a little bit less than normal, but they're not terribly restricted. It's the carbohydrates that are primarily restricted. So the content, the amount that people eat, is very important because if you eat a lot of this diet, it's not healthy because of all the fat. But if you eat a restricted amount of the diet, it can be very, very healthy as the body begins to transition off. And what we do with various individuals who try it, we move them from a 1-to-1 type of diet all the way up to a 3-to-1 or possibly a 4-to-1, and that makes the transition much easier for the individual that would like to battle their cancer using this metabolic approach. But the key is a high-fat diet with low carbohydrates and a transition or a fine-tuning of the diet to match every individual's type of metabolism, so it can be accommodated a little bit easier in their life. The diet is very well accepted for children. There's a group at Johns Hopkins would like to see it as the first line rather than a second line of approach for cancer management. In other words, if the child doesn't respond to the ketogenic diet, then you would consider a pharmaceutical approach. The situation today is that when a child doesn't respond to pharmacy after a number of attempts at cocktails and this sort, then they'll be recommended the ketogenic diet, which in many cases is very therapeutic. and you don't have the toxic effects of the drugs associated with that. So we think this could also be easily adapted to cancer management, again, with the same high therapeutic benefits with minimal, if any, toxicity. So it's a very good fit. This is not a money-generating kind of an approach. So clinical trials, who will step forward to conduct the type of clinical trial that will provide evidence for the use of this approach? So it's not gaining as widespread use, mainly because many of the physicians or oncologists never heard of it. They're unfamiliar with the basic concepts of this. They're not trained to use this. There's little money to be made in this approach. So you put all these together, and it's clear why this approach has not been recognized as a very effective alternative to the current radiation and toxic chemotherapies that are presently being used. I mean, right now there's a trial initiating at the University of Iowa for lung cancer. There's a trial that just completed in Germany looking at tolerability of the diet, and they found it to be mostly tolerable. It had no toxic effects on the patients. This is the European trial. There's a new trial that's starting at the VA at Pittsburgh VA, which is just getting underway. There's another trial from a private practice group out of Bethesda, Maryland, which just recently has approval, and they're recruiting patients at this time. The two studies that have been published in humans, one by Linda Nebling in 1995 and the other one by us in collaboration with a group of Italian physicians, both clearly show efficacy in children and adults. So there's a great need for more of these kinds of trials and analyses in the human population. And there's a real possibility that the humans will respond much better to this therapy than do the animal models. The art that we used in that book came primarily from the work of Robert Pope, who battled Hodgkin's disease back in the 1990s and subsequently passed away from that disease. But during his experience in battling the disease, he was able to incorporate in his artwork the various personal aspects of his experience and that of others who he shared experiences with in the cancer clinic. I've used a number of his artwork. I was given permission by the Robert Pope Foundation to do this, and they were quite happy that I did this. I also used other images from other individuals who have had family members die from cancer, and how this disease impacts the personal experience. So I think when you consider the images of cancer, you have to look at it from all perspectives, not only from a metabolic disease or a genetic disease or a purely abstract series of genetic mutations, but actually what the disease represents as a human suffering. Possible plans for a follow-up layman's version is certainly on the table, and I may need to do this at some point. But you're right about the fact that there are a lot of lay people, significant numbers, who have been able to read and understand a significant amount of what was actually in the book, which is pleasing to me in the sense that it goes beyond just the scientific community. But you're right, you're not going to move the field forward unless those in the trenches that are actually doing the work are convinced that this is the right way to go. Those in the pharmaceutical industry, those in the academic community. You can have a groundswell of interest on the part of the lay public, but without having the scientific evidence to support what the main thrust is, it's going to be hard to change the field. So the most important aspect of this book is to target those key aspects that people are currently investigating with respect to the underlying mechanisms of cancer. And once that can be shifted, then another book which will actually be focused more on the lay public would certainly be in the works. I'd just like to mention that the book was dedicated to the millions of people who have suffered and died from the toxic effects of chemotherapies and continue to do so. And I think our approach is one solution to this problem. Once the underlying mechanisms are recognized and exploited, I think there's a real chance that we can make cancer a very manageable disease with minimal adverse effects to the individuals that have this disease. The Boston College Library was very helpful in providing access of this book to a number of students, both in form of the hardcover as well as the ebook. And the library has done a very excellent job in making this book available to Boston College community and outside the community as well.